Okay, everyone. Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to the WestAF 2022 Arts Leadership and Advocate Seminar, or ALIS. My name is Moana Paule Ho-Ching. I go by she, her, hers, and I consult as a WestAF Senior Policy Analyst. I reside on the traditional lands of the indigenous nations of Utah and recognize that acknowledgement and acknowledging land is just the beginning. It's my pleasure to introduce the next panel, which is loaded with some pretty rad characters and creative doers. But before we do, I just want to set the stage for this next conversation as the panels move from talking about internal networking and advocacy to pivoting outside of the arts and culture sector to think about advocacy innovations that are happening across the general economic landscape and other fields. These fields can provide opportunities for arts advocates and potential areas of intersection and collaborations. Issues such as gig economy and work protections, racial justice and asset building, small businesses and tax policy are all areas in which artists and creative workers can be involved. And we hope that arts advocates might not always be in discussions with advocates in these areas, but we hope that this conversation can start that. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator and longtime advocate for independent workers, Althea Erickson of Russell Lab. I'd also like to acknowledge Althea's modeling of community building and enriching WestAF's and Alice's wealth of networks. So thank you, Althea, for being with us. Althea will be joined by Solana Rice of the Liberation in a Generation, Caroline Bruckner from Kogod Tax Policy Center, Adrian Harrell from Representing Workers Lab, and Renee Johnson with Public-Private Strategies. The depth and breadth of this panel's experience, community knowledge, action, organizing, and implementing policy brings dynamics that will enrich these topics. They're like the Avengers 2.0 of arts advocacy and coalition building. So it was my pleasure to introduce them. But before I turn it over, to Althea, and the rest of the gang, I just want to remind everyone and the audience members that our WestAF team member, Justine Chappell, will be joining at the end of this panel discussion to moderate any questions you may have. So please hold on to those or drop them in the chat. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Althea, and thank you all, Renee, Adrian, Caroline, and Solana. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. My name's Althea Erickson, and I recently joined the Center for Cultural Innovation to help stand up Russell Lab, which is a new advocacy and policy shop dedicated to expanding social and economic protections for arts workers. I'm really excited for this panel. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with glasses wearing, I guess, a striped V-neck shirt in front of a blue flowery wall. And I'm joining today from Brooklyn, New York, the ancestral lands of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie people. Quick just intro to this panel. I think I am sort of new to the arts advocacy ecosystem, though I've been working in the creative economy for a long time, previously at Etsy, and before that at the Freelancers Union, and have been working on these issues around sort of expanding the social safety net for those outside of traditional work. And I think, often was surprised to find myself sort of the only one at the table representing creatives in those conversations. And I think, in the arts advocacy field, there can be a tendency when we think about arts advocacy to focus on funding and public funding, sometimes to the exclusion of other issues. But, the arts are everywhere and arts workers are everywhere. And it feels like there's a real huge opportunity for arts advocates to connect with and join with other sectors and movements to build more resilient and equitable ecosystems that support not just arts institutions, but arts workers themselves, and in particular, arts workers of color. And I think, the arts advocacy field, like many fields, has really been grappling with how to center racial justice and equity in its work. And I think we can learn a ton from the leaders gathered here. And that ultimately, it really feels like there's a big opportunity to work together across sectors and movements to drive broader systems change that we really need to enable if we want the arts and culture field to really thrive. So that's sort of the premise with which we begin this conversation. And I'm super excited about the amazing leaders and advocates that are joining us today. So I want to start out, we're going to start out with introductions and give folks a chance to introduce their work and sort of what they're bringing to the conversation. So I'm going to start by turning it over to Solana Rice from Liberation in a Generation. And I'm going to ask all our panelists to turn off their cameras for this bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Althea. It's great to be with you all today. I am Solana Rice, co-founder and co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation. I am a Black cisgender woman currently located in on the Shoshone Ohlone lands, and also known as Oakland. And it is good to be reminded of that every time I say it. And I am here with a kind of a big ask that we hold a couple of things as true. So I have a couple of slides, and I'm not going to spend too much time, I promise. But I wanted to set some context for how we at Liberation in a Generation see the economy. So on this first slide, you'll see a gallery, and it's got a big portrait done by Kehinde Wiley. And for me, art is storytelling. I'm sure it is for you too. And storytelling is inviting others to step into a world that you're creating. And ever since I was really little, I was drawn to visual arts for the worlds that it creates. As I've grown older, I really am loving the vibe that music can create, especially when you bring people together around music. But in 2017, I think it was thereabouts, I stood in a gallery. It was much like this one, but it was in Seattle. And I stood in front of this Kehinde Wiley portrait, and I was swept into his world immediately. It was a world where people who looked like me had their basic needs met. They were safe and secure. They were valued and compensated. And ultimately, they belonged in a world of abundance, of deservedness, and love. And I'm here as a first, this is a leap that I'm going to take as the first speaker, but I'm going to say that this reality, that people that look like me, we don't live in this reality right now. It's obviously dissonant from our current reality, where racism is profitable, where our skin is a liability, and it can be turned into someone else's assets. And I say that because I think as artists, we need you as a nation. You hold two really important things, and many more, but two things that I'll bring out today is that you can create new stories and new plots and new protagonists, a new story of this nation that is built in economic resilience, economic thriving, economic prosperity, economic liberation, and eventually. And we desperately need that. And you can tell stories of what is and what could be if we expect something different from our economy. You are also a driver of our economy, and we desperately need you there. You are independents, and you can work as collectives. You are providing tremendous goods and values to our communities, not just our economy. And we can see parallels, and I hope that our conversation leads to parallels to other issues of economic justice. But I think it has to be said that whatever justice you're seeking in the world, understanding the economic forces that shape that injustice is important. And so Liberation in a Generation, we focus on telling a new story of the economy, but we also work to support folks that are building power to change the way our economy operates. And so on the next slide, it's just a reminder that the economy that we are currently operating in is oppressive. It's rooted in crimes of theft, exclusion, and exploitation of people of color. And on the next slide, you'll see that this is not just happenstance. This is the fact that this theft, exclusion, and exploitation of people of color is profitable. It oh, and there might not actually be an image there on that slide. But the point is that this theft, exclusion, and exploitation means that racism is profitable and that it's harder to get by for people of color. But this is all by design. And it eventually impacts our ability to actually change the rules of the economy. And so at Liberation in a Generation, we focus on dismantling the oppression economy, as you'll see on the next slide. it has to do with four things: ending the criminalization of people of color, ending the dual financial system where people of color are burdened with mostly debt while white folks have mostly assets, where we curb corporate power and corporate influence, and we end the political suppression of people of color. Now, this is where we all come in, and we all have to be aligned and on board with something that's different. And I think that's where artists come in. I think that's where interesting collaborations come in. And I also think that's where the hope of what the folks after me will be talking about, there's hope in things like the tax code. There's hope in things like anti-monopoly and antitrust and making corporations smaller and more responsible. There's hope in things like wrangling in and telling a new story about who deserves in this nation and what social programs we deserve, right? And those are a lot of the things that my colleagues here on the panel will talk about. Our focus on the next slide, you'll see, is to build a liberation economy. It's very simple in terms of the words. It's very difficult to overcome some of the narratives and tropes that we have about the economy. But we honestly believe that we can advance and deliver with collaboration an economy where all people of color, we have our basic needs met, where we find safety and security, where all our contributions are valued, and where we all belong. And we work with a lot of organizations across the nation, folks like the Dream Defenders in Florida, folks like Community Change in DC, folks like Communities for New California here in California. And I'll tell you that their fights are these, right? That they are the ones that are ending the pillars of oppression that hold us back. And they're about building a liberation economy. And we do this in partnership with organizers who are building power. And I hope, my sincere hope is that we do this more in line with artists who are not only can be telling a new story of the economy, but also positioning themselves as, and positioning yourselves as necessary to the economy. So lastly, I'll just say, the Liberation in a Generation, we're a national movement support organization. We're working to dismantle economic oppression and build liberation and secure power for people of color. And I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on this panel about what that looks like in every day for artists, and look forward to hearing questions, concerns, excitements from our conversation later. And I don't need that slide. I'm all done. Thanks.
All right, we're back. Thanks so much, Solana. And now I'm going to hand it over to Caroline.
Thank you so much. I'm not quite sure how I can follow that, being the tax nerd that I am, but I'm going to give it my best effort. My name is Caroline Bruckner, and I am a tax professor at American University's Kogod School of Business. I'm also the managing director of the Kogod Tax Policy Center. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm in Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill specifically, which sits on the Anacostan and Piscataway people's lands. You're wondering why I am here today. And the reason that I'm here today is because I do research on and advocate for small business owners. And I particularly focus on the smallest of small business owners, many times people that have a full-time job and are running what they don't even acknowledge is actually a business on the side. And those are gig workers. But I don't just look at what the media oftentimes deems as gig workers. I look at people that have work on the side outside of traditional employment relationships. And the reason that I do that is because these people work and contribute to their household income, but are consistently overlooked, undervalued, in our public policy arena. And I know that because I came to academia after serving on as chief counsel to the United States Senate Committee for Small Business and Entrepreneurship. And while I am a tax nerd, I learned over the course of my career as a lawyer a lot about small businesses, how they get started, entrepreneurship, when they grow, when they don't. And oftentimes when I was working on policy like the Affordable Care Act or other really important small business initiatives to help the small businesses grow, it was often the smallest of small business owners, either self-employed workers or independent contractors, and definitely people that still had a full-time job, but were earning income on the side that were consistently overlooked. And so when I moved into academia, I brought with me a new academic agenda to focus on these workers and to consider them from the perspective of our tax rules as small businesses. And the problem is, first and foremost, so bad because we don't collect data for tax purposes and for many of our social programs in an inclusive way. We don't do a good enough job collecting demographic data in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, or even geographic data that is reflected in our public policy decision making. And nowhere is that more apparent than in our tax rules. And to many people, when you talk about the tax code, they immediately seize up and they get confrontational or defensive. And it's because tax rules are what dictate what amount of money the government takes from every paycheck or that people owe to the government. Now, there are lots of reasons why the government takes this money. And it is, there is this long saying that every tax professor has, which is taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. And taxes are what pay for vaccines and roads and security and a whole host of things and education. And increasingly, what I've seen in just my 15 years of working on these issues, the tax code is increasingly how we are moving social programs. And we saw that most distinctively in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, when the economy cratered in March of 2020 and Congress had to respond. The initial and only place that they looked to get emergency payments out to people who lost their jobs, who needed to put food on the table, and who we needed to support was through the tax system. And that has become an increasingly common strategy of moving social policy through our tax system. But our tax system isn't set up for everybody. It's set up primarily around the idea that you are going to be a worker and you are going to work for one employer, and that employer is going to take a little bit of money out of your paycheck and put that towards your income taxes and your Social Security contributions. And by the way, those Social Security contributions get tracked, and then when you retire, there's a really complicated formula that gets implemented based on your earnings that dictates how much retirement earnings you have. And that's essentially how our tax system is set up for most individuals. Businesses are different. But even for most individuals that are small business owners, that, are individual business owners, people that, that's how our tax system is set up. But that's not how we work. And every single one of you on this call knows that's not how you work. Just think for 1 minute how many side hustles you might have, or someone in your household has, or your best friend has, or your child has. I am a tax professor for American University. I'm also a gig worker. The IRS hires me to tell them how to do inclusive research. And that is a part of my household income that is never reflected in any data, that is never collected or used to analyze how we should create social programs to help everybody. And this primarily disadvantages those that are low-wage workers. And my work focuses a lot on how people do different kinds of supplemental earn income on as a supplemental source of income, which is not their primary source of income, which may be many artists who can't sustain a full income on their work, and how the tax system isn't set up to facilitate either tax compliance of those workers, so it sets them up for potential audit exposure, but also primarily what I look at is retirement financing, because the number one way that people across this country save for retirement is through paying their taxes. But if you are an independent worker or a self-employed worker and you are not familiar with the tax rules, and chances are you're not, because our tax literacy across this country is so low, you don't know how to comply with those rules, and you don't, not because you're trying to avoid paying taxes, but because you didn't know, because we don't teach you in school. It's really hard to figure it out by trying to read the irs.gov or the SBA's website. So we make it even more challenging for workers like that to comply with our tax code and even contribute the minimum amount that they could for retirement financing. And this matters. This particularly matters coming out into 2022, where we see how we work is changing even more. And we're starting to see private sector survey data that says that it's not just 10% of the population that's an independent contractor. Nope. The numbers are so much higher. It's as high as 50 million people. And yet we have a tax system that does not acknowledge or help or facilitate compliance for these workers. And so what I spend a lot of time doing is looking at these workers, but then I also spend a lot of time looking at women business owners, because there are a lot of provisions in the tax code that are targeted to help the smallest of small business owners get access to capital. But again, these people don't know how to use the tax code. And yet at the same time, we're moving more and more programs through the tax code. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and can contribute the kind of experience that I had working on Capitol Hill and what I see in the research and the data. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Caroline. That was very helpful and informative. So now I'm going to pass it over to Adrian. Adrian, are you there?
I think so. Can you hear me and see me, Althea? Awesome. How are you, my friend?
Hi, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's rare that I get to speak. This is such a different panel than all the panels that I've ever spoken at, because it's about the arts and creativity, and I'm really happy to be a part of it and hope that I can contribute. My name is Adrian, and I run an organization called the Workers Lab. Our purpose at the Workers Lab is really premised on two things, really. We believe that virtually everything that is supposed to be for workers in this country, the tax code, Caroline, major federal labor laws, the technology, the programs, the services, the list can go on and on and on. All of those things, by and large, are either old or exclusive, sometimes because they're old. And so we believe that we need a whole bunch of new ideas about how to better serve more and different all kinds of workers in this country. And so that's why our purpose at the Workers Lab is to give new ideas for and with workers a chance to succeed. We do that primarily as an investor. And I would say over the last 3 years, more of those investments and more of those new ideas have come to us from either worker leaders or advocates or entrepreneurs inside the so-called gig economy, right? And so I'd say last year, because of that, we made a decision to bone up on gig work and gig workers. And like Caroline said, this country doesn't do a particularly great job at collecting data, and certainly not on this particular part of the workforce, as I've learned. So we are now on a big learning journey, as some of my fellow panelists know, to learn more and to get smarter about and to get more innovative and creative about the ways that we serve this particular group of workers in this country. There are 4 questions, because I feel like out of everything that I've learned about the gig economy, the one thing that I'm sitting with is that we are somehow, as a field, as a movement, whatever you want to call it, like somehow we're like everywhere and also nowhere at the same time about this issue. It's a strange, sort of elusive thing. So there are 4 questions that are on my mind all the time when I talk about gig workers. And that is, the first one is a big mega question, which is what counts as work now in this country? What counts as work? I think it's a big question that we need to sort of, it's a very sort of highfalutin question, but it's important, right? What counts as work now? How many people are doing this work? How much do they make? And who are they? And so we have partnered with the Aspen Institute, Shelley Stewart, who's amazing, and her great team over there, to go out and learn directly from workers about the questions I just rattled off, but also about what they think themselves they need to be safe, healthy, and secure in their work. I think we're doing that because one of the things that I noticed in my sort of research landscape review, whatever, is that by and large, on the national scale, most of the research that's out there either isn't directly centered on workers or has a political objective in mind at the end of it, or a policy objective. We need to hear directly from workers what they want in this type of work, to dispel the myth that flexible work is inherently bad work or precarious work. It is not. People with power in this country have chosen to make it precarious work, and just as easily can choose differently. And so we are on like a journey both to learn, but to demonstrate how to make that possible. And I can talk about some of our work in that regard later. The one thing I wanted to say that I think is unique to this group, I think as a field, as a progressive, field, labor movement, there's the conversations about power for workers often center around economics and politics. And I think that's pretty obvious, right? And necessary, by the way. I think the third leg of that stool that continues to elude my progressive colleagues, I love them to death, is cultural power, right? Which is something you can't really touch or feel. It's really hard to measure, right? I don't know how I have this job. My background is in communications. I was a speechwriter forever before this job. The corporations, though, and companies understand culture. They understand marketing. They understand storytelling. They understand the power of social media and celebrity and all of that. We do not. And in philanthropy, the investments going into real culture change and real narrative work is slim. And I think this group has a particularly unique vantage point in that world, I think, and is uniquely poised to help folks like myself and Caroline and others introduce that paradigm into the enterprise of how we achieve power for workers in this country. Jennifer Coolidge is on the TV doing ads for Uber Eats, right? How do we do that? Where's our commercial about how gig workers are supposed to fare in this country, right? We should be doing that. We should be in the bloodstream of this country and engage consumers and customers in the enterprise of achieving worker power, because when workers succeed, I know it sounds corny, we all do, because most of us work. And so looking forward to the conversation and happy to contribute as much as I can. Thanks, Althea.
Thanks so much, Adrienne. And now I'm going to pass it off to Renee.
Well, hello, everyone. Excited to be here. It's interesting to go last because it's like, wow, everyone here has given so many gems and dropped so many bombs here. I'm like, well, Jesus, I don't know how to close the service here. But hey, I'm here. My name's Renee Johnson. I'm a senior advisor with public-private strategies. And our organization, we do a lot of things. And one thing that we do is advocate. We advocate for small businesses. And so what does that mean? Well, many of you probably don't even consider yourself a small business owner. One thing I think the pandemic has taught us is anyone could be a small business owner. If you have an idea, if you have something that you love to do, and you want to be paid for it, which rightfully you should, you can be a small business owner. And you don't have to have people work for you to be a small business owner. So that skill that you have, where it's singing, dancing, drawing, whether it's playing a musical instrument, you are a business owner and you should look at yourself as such. So when we had all these amazing programs that rolled out during COVID, unfortunately, you weren't at the table. You weren't at the table to be discussed to get relief. Why? Many of you do not see yourselves as business owners, and that's not good because you are. So how do we change that? Well, that narrative needs to change. Sorry, my little ear pod keeps falling out. Needs to change today. And that's why we're all here. We're here to have this conversation because we want you to all look at things a little bit different because your lives matter. And it matters in the sense of how you go out there and talk about things that matter to you as you want to grow and work for yourselves and do the things that you love. So being a business owner doesn't mean that you have to have millions of dollars. It just means that you have to understand a few things about taxes that Caroline's talked about, understand some cultural things that are happening, and then going to talk to some people to make sure that you are voicing what you feel works for you and helps you through your day-to-day. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to help you understand that. And some of those things that we help on are like issues like paid leave, with healthcare, with taxes. And that's what I've done all my career. Now, I started on the Hill and I worked for a few members of Congress. I went to law school, but before that, I was like many of you. I played an instrument, played the violin for 13 years. I thought I was an artist, not as good as many of you. And that's why I went to law school, because I was not that good. I could not thrive in that field. So I went to law school and I wanted to be an advocate for others. I wanted to speak up for others. I wanted to be able to help others be able to do what they wanted to do. So that's why I came to DC, the wonderful District of Columbia, to Congress. And I worked on the Hill for a few members of Congress. And I was there trying to teach others who look like me, many who are different cultures, who probably didn't have access to a member of Congress in their community. I come from Chicago, the west side of Chicago. Didn't really see many members of Congress where I grew up. Didn't really know much about members of Congress, but I knew I played a violin, I liked art, I liked to read. So I learned how to figure out the space. But I also wanted someone to speak up for me too, but there wasn't anyone. So I had to become that someone. See where I'm going with this? So many of you are here today and you're learning about advocacy. But guess what? You also know that you want healthcare. You want better access to healthcare. You want better access to tax policy because you understand, hey, I pay a lot of money and they're taking a lot of money out of my taxes, but I'm not really sure why. I feel like I should own my business, but I don't know the steps. You know, that PPP, Paycheck Protection Plan, why did Shake Shack get money, but I didn't? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. You weren't at the table. I started with that, a preference with that, and that's why today we're all here. The PPP was a conversation that many people who were at the table were corporations, right? They were bigger businesses. They were not sole proprietors like many of you. They weren't LLCs or someone who worked by themselves or a smaller business of 10 or fewer employees, right? So they didn't have someone there to represent them. They weren't a lot of minority business owners. There weren't people who probably didn't speak another language as their first language that were at the table. So we need to be there at that table. And how do we do that? That's through advocacy. That's through communicating with our members of Congress, through our local representation, through connecting to people who like Carolina, who used to work on the Hill, as staffers and making sure that they hear our voices. When we're talking about healthcare and health policy, that's making sure that we have things like the Affordable Healthcare Plan, where some people think it's Obamacare. Well, guess what? It's the same thing. But if you don't know the difference in title, I mean, you may feel a different way. But it's all about understanding these things so that you're able to talk about them, but also being the representation of your community to have that accessibility to be able to do it. So we're here to answer any of those questions, talk through those things, and really, really talk about it because they make a huge difference in how you're able to, one, see yourself as a leader in your community, being identifying as yourself as a small business owner, taking that ownership, taking those steps and saying, okay, I'm going to go get a license and make myself this thing with my state or territory, right? And saying, like, now I'm a small business owner. What are the next resources I need in order to do these things? And then also advocating for yourself because your voice needs to be heard. And it should be heard because you are able, as a group of artists, to make a lot of noise. So that's all I have for right now.
Thank you so much, Renee. Thank you, everybody. That was amazing, really incredible, and I feel so inspired. I'm going to ask Adrian to come back on camera. Hey, Adrian. So we can shift into the moderated conversation part of the panel. You know, I think one of the things I'm so excited about this group of people is everybody comes from a very different field and world. And I think the opportunity is not just to sort of bring that expertise and that experience to this room of arts advocates, but also to learn from each other. So I'm really excited to hear how you all sort of engage in this conversation as well, and to learn from all of you. You know, I want to sort of shift. I think, you know, we heard a lot about sort of the particular tactics and approaches that each of you take to your work. And I want to think a bit, and many of you touched on sort of the importance of narrative and the importance of culture. And I think we know that sort of we are in these sort of shared efforts to drive broader systemic change, and that those efforts would benefit from greater alliance with the arts community and arts workers. I'd love to hear from you what narratives or frames need to change or shift in order to connect arts workers and the arts more deeply to your own work. And maybe Solana, we could start with you.
I'll answer it this way. And I really appreciate all the other panelists. I was like jotting notes as you all were talking. And something that really stood out for me is the piece that Adrian mentioned about culture and about the idea that to me, when I hear culture, I think about beliefs and values. And it actually is how we convey beliefs and values. And our economy is based on beliefs and values. And when we ask the question, like, what constitutes work? In the nation, we have said that only certain people and only certain types of work deserves to be compensated and valued and included. And I think that is a deeply entrenched narrative that we have to be on a serious campaign about, this idea of deservedness. And Caroline mentioned this about the tax code. It's not set up to really value folks that are laboring. It's set up to value folks that have capital and who can get more capital through that tax code, right? We know this. Tax rates are higher for folks that file on their income versus filing on their wealth, right? So I think there's a question of deservedness. I think there's a question about abundance that we have to really get at in this conversation too. We have been told that we are limited in what we can fund, folks. We just can't make sure that everybody is taken care of. That's not true, right? So there's this notion of deservedness, who really deserves to be a beneficiary of the wealth of the nation and gets included in our sort of circle of wealth, honestly, as a nation. There's a question of abundance. Yes, we fund a lot of programs through our tax code. It's not the only way we fund programs. And we actually have a lot of discretionary money that's not on the fiscal policy side, right? We decide a lot about how people get money through banks. You know, communities right now are struggling with building affordable housing. That's mostly because banks are saying affordable housing is a risky bet. I can't afford it. That's a monetary decision. That's not necessarily calling your member of Congress to say we need more money in our communities, right? I'm really struggling on how not to seem like doom and gloom. It's where I'm at right now. But I think artists actually hold a really important key to making sure that it's not doom and gloom, that partnering with groups like the ones on the call to unearth these narratives about the economy, but also present a different vision going forward. I'll stop there. That's my thoughts.
I'm just going to pass it around. So maybe Caroline, do you have thoughts on that one?
I do. And I have thoughts that are related to when we prepped for this call and we talked about it. And one thing, because this is a different kind of audience than I would normally be talking to. And one of the things that Althea, you had said to me is, you know, look, this is an audience that has been focused on the charitable deduction. So can you talk about that? And I can't speak to necessarily the larger economy or every issue out there, but I can speak on the tax side of things, how, you know, the advocates that are watching this panel, that are on this call, need to think more strategically outside of just the charitable deduction in the tax space of what they're advocating for. Because everyone else for you know, since 1913 has been fighting to get a piece of the pie in the tax space. And, you know, the charitable deduction is not the only way to have an opportunity to fund arts programming or initiatives. And I think that understanding that our tax system reflects our budget and it reflects our values as a result, and what we value and what we prioritize. And, you know, I do think that we, you know, there is not a silver bullet. This is, I'm very much, you know, in order to solve problems, I very much believe in the spaghetti offense, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, because it's not like there's just going to be one, it's not like you can just make a fix in the tax code, right? Like, it's not like you can just fix, you know, banking rules around community banks. And we've already talked about how there needs to be an overall cultural shift. I mean, in my view, one of the overarching themes that I've really come around to, that I've appreciated the Biden administration's leadership on, is day one, when President Biden took office, he said, I want to look at every single federal agency and I want to look at every single program and see if the data around it is inclusive. And he set up an interagency task force to look at the inclusiveness of data that's used for federal programs, not just in the tax code, but across every federal agency. What was important about that initiative is that it included the tax code for the first time, because it is a longstanding, entrenched, racist belief that the tax code doesn't discriminate in terms of race or gender, and that's not true. Any tax lawyer or tax expert out there will say, well, yes, the tax code discriminates. It picks winners and losers. Somebody qualifies for a deduction or somebody doesn't, or somebody qualifies for a credit or somebody doesn't, but they do it based on income and if you're in the right industry. But that's never an inclusive or holistic way to look at problem solving with policy. And the data that policymakers use and that we all agree to when we vote for people who decide to raise or lower our tax rates, has just been so far based on, well, are you in this bracket or are you in that tax bracket? As opposed to, 95% of the beneficiaries of this particular tax provision are white men. Now, if we had that kind of program outcome in any other agency, any other program in the federal government, that would be deemed unconstitutional. But because we have civil rights laws don't apply to our tax laws, it's like there has been this whole development of how to allow for spending and distributing benefits across all these different industries and businesses to the exclusion of everyone else. And, in my view, I don't know that you're going to win a lawsuit alleging that it's unconstitutional. I seriously doubt you are. But I bet you could change public perception and culture if you had tax data that says 95% of the people that take advantage of this tax break, which, by the way, costs $100 billion, are, two companies, one of which is owned by, so-and-so or such and such. And because we don't drill down and really have an inclusive view of the people that are benefiting from all the programs we run through the tax code, I think that there's not a culture change. I don't think that policymakers are making informed choices about what they're choosing to fund that way or not. And again, it's not going to solve everything, but I think that it could meaningfully change how we solve problems if we start to normalize expectations around, no, I want to know how this program affects people, not just if they're in the 35% bracket or, or lower wage people, but how many people of color, how many women business owners can take advantage of this. I think people would have a much different perception of how money is spent through the tax code. I think that's one way that we could really have better outcomes with our spending and our policies.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And it's just like the farce of colorblind policymaking is so crazy. And I think we just
but it's colorblind, so clearly it's not
exactly, exactly,
right?
exactly.
So factor any of that into it's got to be fair.
Right. And I do think that narrative shift and change, and sort of we are, the goal here is to like open people's eyes also to see, oh my goodness, my computer battery is running low. Let's not have Althea disappear while she's moderating. So anyway, I think it's really important. And I think it really illustrates sort of the ways in which the way in which people see the world determines what they think is the right and wrong policy answers, and what even the world of the possible is, to bring it to the place of hope as opposed to fear or downers. I'm wondering, Adrian, if I can bring you into this conversation around the narrative piece, because I know that's a lot of what you all have engaged in as well.
Sure. Yeah, we're thinking about this inside the Workers Lab a lot, because we are not a sort of narrative culture making organization, right? But hear me out, because I think we're trying to see if we can sort of play in that sandbox, because as we all agree here, there's like a desperate need. And in my mind, as a communications person before this job, I just think there's so much opportunity. There's enough money, energy, enthusiasm happening on the advocacy, economic, political, you know what I mean? All of that is sort of where the energy is. And like I said at the top, like this, we got to get our act together as progressives and as pro-worker people on culture change, real culture change, not a 2-year grant that's restricted to whatever, right? We're talking millions, if not billions of dollars, humongous partnerships, the ad council, et cetera. And so let me just talk about that. The way that I'm thinking about it right now is like, when I think about, well, the reason why I think it's so important, Althea, is because I would argue, and I think the point is arguable, that the primary driving cultural force in this country for workers, probably until the 1990s-ish, were labor unions, right? Not only in the advocacy, but like they were in our homes. Anybody who grew up in a union home knows, like, you wore your dad's t-shirt to go, Teamsters t-shirt to go to bed, and you went to the barbecues on 4th of July. And it was just this country was putting people out into the world that came entrenched with those values, right? They sort of knew a little bit and had some sort of concept. And as the role of labor unions, I think, has decreased in this country for reasons we shouldn't get into on this call, so has the cultural role they've played in the kind of workforce we're putting out into the world. And so the question for me becomes, well, how do we make up for that now, right? How do we create that kind of culture again? And the best that I can answer my own question is like by thinking about broadly, like, who creates culture in this country? For me, it's youth. And it's always been young people. And then I think about, well, then if that's the case, Adrienne, well, why aren't young people are out on the streets on Black lives, they're out in the streets on climate, they're out on the streets on gays, on women, on guns, but they're not necessarily out in the streets on the one thing that they all probably are going to do or do already, which is work. And people forget that the March for Freedom in Washington was a bunch of young Black people fighting for wages, right? How do we create that kind of animus in this country? Who is the group that owns that work? How much money do we need? What kind of data? All of that stuff. Like, somebody needs to create that strategy, and have a movement, like a cultural renaissance for workers in this country, be driven by young people. It's desperately, desperately, desperately needed as a supplement, a complement to all of the really fancy advocacy, sort of more highbrow academic work that's happening in Washington and New York. And it's a place for artistry, right? Who's more creative than young people, right? So there are a bunch of dots to be connected here. And I'm in a sort of like strategic, frustrated moment because I see the problem, but the organization that I run isn't quite, you know what I mean? The purpose. So we're trying to figure it out, and would welcome, I think that's where partnerships with groups like the one we're speaking with today, like, there's a lot of promise there. That's not like hyperbole. I really think there's a lot of promise there. And so open to talking about that and my crazy thoughts on culture sometime in the future.
It's not crazy. And I think it's so interesting. Like, I think about your work, Adrienne, and how it's really, you guys have really focused in on the gig economy as this particular sector of the workforce for whom just labor protections aren't there. And, I think about your work, Renee, which really is centered on the small business owner. And I think about how the work that each of you like really lead operates in parallel when the folks that you each represent actually share almost all of the same sort of working conditions, particularly Renee on the like sole proprietor side, right? It's businesses of one, maybe they self-identify as businesses, maybe they don't, but they, yes, they're sort of business owners, but the challenges that they face are really similar. They're the same. They're worker challenges, right? It's how do I get health insurance? How do I get access to benefits? All these things that, to your point, Adrienne, like labor unions fought for. And I think there's, sort of this challenge of identity where, in particular, for folks that are in that gray space between worker and business owner, that because those terms separate us, there isn't a lot of like coming together around a collective or shared vision for what sort of more universal protections could be. And I know, Solana, your work really does speak to sort of that universal vision. I wonder, Renee, if you could speak a little bit about, especially with like the Main Street Alliance, the ways in which positioning your community can be helpful to advancing your particular policy goals, or are there narratives that sort of like, or positionings or framings that really stand in the way and prevent you from making the progress that you're pushing for?
Yeah, I think there's opportunities where sometimes they fall short. And I think it's because when you're looking at marginalized communities, sometimes when advocating, there's this, we got to uplift this marginalized community and we got to put it out there. We want to put it out there. We want to put it out there. But the impact it has to that marginalized community isn't what we're saying, right? And an example would be for paid leave. Paid leave is not something that's going to help the working mom at a grocery store that gets a 10-hour-a-week shift. Paid leave isn't going to help her. Now, it may help the, wonderful person in a middle class life in a suburban community, but the narratives are different, and we have to be careful that it's not a one size fit all situation when we're doing advocacy. And we cannot make these situations where, because you're a person of color, we would need to prop you up and use you and say that this is going to help communities of color, and it's not a community of color's issue. We need to be very careful about these things because we're doing more harm than we're doing good. Because that same mother of 4 who has these very few hours, who's going out there and putting her face out there for this issue, can be impacted by losing her job, losing opportunities in her local community, and may not have a job later. So we're creating damages here. So we need to be very careful about angling situations and how we're doing this advocacy. Now, we want to make sure, yes, paid leave works, and we want paid leave. Paid leave is amazing. I love paid leave. Like, let's be honest, it does help communities. But let's make sure that the advocacy that we're doing is going to be fruitful for those who we're putting out there. And then also, let's give support to those that we're doing the advocating for or with. An example could be, I actually did some advocating with a group, and this man actually lost pretty much all of his life savings. He took a payday loan, and it was a very bad group of people who were predatory. And they literally took all of his savings, all of his children's college funds, and he was just down and out in his luck. And there were organizations, not any that I worked with, that were out here promoting him and telling his story. And like, this is why we can't do paid leave. This is why we can't do paid, predatory loan, excuse me. And yes, we need to tell the story, but this man is repeating this story day in and day out. He's on the news telling the story. He is putting his face, his name, his business name out there. So it's like, what is the recovery that he gets? So in advocacy, we have to be mindful that we are dealing with real people, with real experiences, with real businesses, with real situations, with workers as well. So when we're advocating, we need to also have some soft hands with these situations and come to these situations knowing that one size does not fit all, that we need to have some compassion and empathy with people, and that also we should have a resolution on how are we going to help those that we are putting out here and telling their stories. Because at the end of the day, they're not whole. They're not whole still, right? They're telling their story because they don't want someone else to be impacted, and we want to help, but we also want to make sure that they're taken care of too. And that's very important when it comes to advocating, because again, people will use these stories, and yes, we want to get the word out, but we want to make sure people are taking care of people, because advocating only helps and works when we're taking care of each other, because it is a community, and we should be making sure we're taking care of each other while we're advocating.
Althea, do you mind if I
was just going to turn it over to you. Yeah, go.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think there's something that all of us have said but not said, and it's about telling the truth. Caroline talked about the truth of the impact of the tax code. Renee talked about the truth that paid leave isn't actually going to serve everybody. Adrian talked about the truth that, like, young people, and I think someone put it in the chat too, young people do not identify with unions, and they don't necessarily identify with like how we projected work to be, right? They're not really like, let's sign me up for that. And so I guess, like, to me, that's why I feel like artists can be so helpful, but we all have work to be doing about telling the truth of the realities that we're living. And I think so many times like we're trying to like win the argument or win the day up on the hill. So we've got to say the certain thing, or we're trying to give people hope, or you know, we're telling people things that we deeply believe but still aren't really true. And I think that's it's almost like the relationship that we have to build with one another to be able to say the truth. That there are no silver bullets, there aren't the magic things. We're going to advocate for this today. It is not going to solve all of the things. We're going to advocate for this today. We might lose, but we're winning the narrative argument. Like we're winning on why we need these paid leave protections, et cetera. Like I feel like there's a real truth telling that people are eager for, because the narrative currently isn't matching up with people's lived realities. And folks can see that plainly and will dismiss it immediately, which is why I think we're seeing so much despondency, right? Because you're like, wait, this is what you're telling me, this is the headlines, but like, what are we actually doing about it?
Well, and to your point, Solana, I'm sorry, just going to hop in because you just jogged my memory about something. We're creating precedent. And I think that's what sometimes we need to say. We're doing this fight because, yes, we're helping this group, which will then help this group, which can help this group, which can help this group. Because if you look at it from any kind of angle, whether it's a court proceeding or any kind of thing that you're building towards, you're doing a drum beat, you're building momentum, you're carrying the mantle, flagging the flame, throw another analogy in there, right? But what you're doing is making something work for one that you're approving works for somebody else, maybe just in a little bit different of a way, but you're showing that it works.
I think Solana raises a really good point, and I think truth is one way to talk about it, but I also think it's about managing expectations, because it's going to come November and the midterms are going to happen, and voters whose expectations for the Biden administration and the Democrats that they elected are, going to be on the chopping block. And overpromising and consistently under-delivering is the hallmark of every politician in Washington, D.C. And it's not, I don't say that as an indictment. I say that because when democracy works, not everybody wins, right? Compromise has to happen. And, the problem of where we are now is that compromise isn't even on the table, right? And as a result, there is just wild expectations, and that could be what is so disillusioning to youth. I mean, I work with youth all the time. I'm a college professor. They're in my classrooms, and it's interesting because they are they're motivated on certain issues that I don't see politicians listening to. And I think that it's I think that they quickly become disillusioned, and that is because people aren't speaking honestly or truthfully or managing expectations about what you can do and what you can't do. And that's hard. I mean, you don't want to stand up in front of an angry crowd and tell them the truth and risk, the backlash or, consequences of that. I think that there's been a real absence of managing expectations that we need to, I think the way that Solana phrased it was perfect. Like, we got this win and this is a good thing. It's not going to solve all the problems. But this is a good thing. And I think that if there were more honesty about that, I think we'd get a lot further.
I think that's 100% totally fair. And I think especially when you think about federal policy, it can feel overwhelming. And I feel like we keep driving down to cynicism, and I want to bring us back to hope. So, because that's just how I am. But I was thinking as you were talking, Caroline, about the midterms and all these things, and I was like, well, what's the counterexample? And I thought, Adrian, I would love if you could share a little bit about the work that you all did around getting gig workers access to unemployment protection with your partnership with steady, because I think examples like that, and I won't tell it for you, but just, to me, there are paths forward that get us ever closer. And, we are on long time we are trying to build towards a more just world that will take a long time to get towards, and taking those wins as we go and making some incremental progress, I think is really important and can be like deeply revolutionary. So I don't know, Adrienne, if you could share a little bit about that, I think that'd be great.
Sure. So we, going back to what we do, which is primarily as an investor in a bunch of different high risk sort of experiments to create things to demonstrate that there's a better way. We partnered up with really what we do is we sort of often sit in the middle of some pretty uncomfortable parties or situations, right? And hold the line to get something done for workers. In the case of this project that Althea is talking about, we sat in the middle of a pretty scrappy group of drivers in Philadelphia who are awesome, called the Philadelphia Drivers Union, and a tech company called Steady, and brought those two together to create a tech solution that would automate the process of verifying income in the administration of unemployment benefits. This was, of course, at the height of the pandemic, when the federal government made a non-standard or gig workers eligible for pandemic unemployment insurance. One of the big problems was, how do you verify income that doesn't fit the traditional 9-to-5 paradigm? Big problem. And so we tried to help in that regard, right? And inevitably created this tech solution. We're just wrapping up pilots in Louisiana and Alabama. And I just testified in front of Congress on like how this is a win-win, how automating income verification is a win-win for, speaking about the hard nature of the politics, Caroline, how this was a win-win for really everybody, right? Like less headaches for the workers, you mitigate against fraud inside the state, et cetera, right? The one thing I'll add to that example of the kind of work that we do is, and I was just having this really tough conversation with my staff on Friday, is I will acknowledge that that work, even after all of that work, that was really awesome, I think, and has a ton of value in demonstrating to policymakers and to a bunch of other folks that, like, if you chose to make this possible, like, here's how you do it. Here's the roadmap. But they still have to choose to make it possible, right? Even after all of that work, the unemployment insurance laws are largely still the same. It's still exclusive. It's still designed around a sort of white man's type of work, 9-to-5. And so while we did some pretty awesome work, I don't really consider it the work of change necessarily, right? And I'm sitting with that as the leader of this organization because the laws are still the same, right? Even though what we demonstrated was pretty awesome. So there's a limit, I would say, even in my work as a sort of innovation organization. And I think that's why it's so important to work in partnership with others who are working like on identity, for example, or in that world, right? But I'm pretty realistic about the fact, I want to be careful not to call it systems change, because the system is still largely the same after that experiment, right? There are other examples I could go on about, but I'll stop there.
I disagree. I think what you did was awesome, and I am encouraged. First of all, I work a lot in this space, and I wrote, a major 150-page article calling out Congress for authorizing the unemployment assistance program for gig workers and not knowing how much to fund it because they didn't collect the data. And like I was, I did all these news hits and, all these conferences, talked to all these lawmakers, and you just showed them how to do it. Now, my approach, of course, would be to look at the tax data, but they don't like to mess with the tax code. That's why it's taking me forever to get change done in that space, because there's all sorts of privacy concerns or what have you. But you just gave them an alternative and you told me about it. And that's amazing. That is the fact that you testified. And keep in mind, from start until finish, it usually takes 10 years to make a law. Okay. I mean, that's just the reality of our legislative process. And, it's hard. It requires, it's not for the faint of heart. And the fact that, you were able to develop a program that you showed works and were able to, really testify about it so quickly, that's huge progress and should be celebrated. And Congress pays attention. When I worked for Senator Landrieu for the Senate Small Business Committee, the earthquake in Haiti happened. And you know who was on the ground before anyone else handing out food? Jose Andres. And FEMA started paying attention. All these other groups started paying attention. How come this chef guy can get food out to workers and can do this more efficiently? And he really built an entire operation by, just going on the ground. I'm not saying anyone should do that. I think he's an exceptional person and wildly qualified now to do it because he has so much experience. But, by virtue of his example, all these other agencies paid attention to what he was doing and how they were able to get food on the ground and food into people who needed it most in times of emergencies through a process that's now been replicated over and over and over again. And so don't undersell those small accomplishments or, understate that problem solving. People pay attention. I'm paying attention. And I don't really matter, but I can now incorporate it into my work. And, of course, we're going to have a call after this, and I'm going to get your commitment on that publicly in front of all these people. But like that is, I think it's a huge thing. And I'm sure the fact that you testified, you gave Congress another avenue about how to verify income, because it was a huge problem during the pandemic.
Oh my God,
people could not substantiate that they had earned money because they didn't have tax forms to go get unemployment insurance. And it meant the difference between being able to put food on the table or pay rent. It was a life or death scenario in some situations, and it was really important. And that kind of problem solving can be filed away for the next time, God forbid, there is, another comparable crisis.
Yeah. I'm going to put Caroline Bruckner out on front of the Workers Lab to talk about that program all the time and that experiment all the time.
Well, I mean, hopefully you can get me to figure out how to put my name properly, so that like it's there instead of me, because I still can't figure that out. Sorry.
Amazing. Well, we have 15 minutes left. I think we're supposed to pause and transition over to questions, but I don't know if there's any questions in the chat. So everybody, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. I'm saying it now. Otherwise, I'm going to keep asking my questions. All right, I'm asking my question. I'm going. All right, so, I want to take it back to what Renee was talking about when she was talking about the experience of the advocate and the person who was really like a victim of predatory lending, and was describing, what I think is clearly sort of extractive advocacy strategies. And I know that's not the way that it always works. And Solana, I would love it. You described Liberation in the Generation as a movement support organization. And I think it's really, really interesting and amazing the way that you work with movement organizations. And I was wondering if you could share a bit about that, because I think, and to bring it back to the arts advocacy space, I think that COVID really brought forward the challenges that arts workers faced in that pandemic. And we talked, we were just talking about how important that pandemic unemployment assistance was. And, creatives really leaned on that and were included in that for the first time, basically ever. And I think that, arts advocates really thinking about how to support arts workers in addition to arts institutions is an evolving area in the arts advocacy space. And I think the way that you all approach that movement building and support work is really inspirational. I wonder if you could just share a little bit about your approach.
Yeah, sure. So work with groups that are mostly people of color led. I mentioned a couple of them, folks like Communities for a New California, Dream Defenders, Community Change, folks in Nevada. We sort of have like a three-legged stool. One is about building a relationship with these organizations. We're essentially a consultant. Usually consultants parachute in and they're like, here's the policy you need. Go forth and go to the hill. You got this. That is not what we hope to do or replicate. What we do is we actually sit and listen for quite a while to where groups are at. For example, the folks at United We Dream, powerful organizers, right? Working on the right for immigrants to belong in this nation. Got the DACA Act was really important in that. And they're at the point where they're like, we have a big vision about what our immigration system should look like. And so we're sitting and listening to them. These are folks that have been in the halls of Congress working on these issues and feel like they want a different approach. They want new language. And we're not there to give them new language. We're there to ask the right questions and walk in partnership with them. And this goes to Adrian's point. We don't actually need to generate new ideas from scratch. The people that are in these systems, that have been advocating for these systems, that have been victims of these systems too often, actually have a lot of the answers. For Liberation in a Generation, what we try to do is take those answers and then also apply them to large scale systems. So for example, we're having a conversation about gun violence in Florida. And yes, there are tons of things about gun control, for example, that we could propose that people are doing. There are things about gun violence prevention, safe streets, ceasefire, etc. And the groups that we're working with are like, yeah, we get that might help maybe in the short term, but in the long term, it's the economics of these communities that need to drastically shift. And so that's the path that we walk with people. Basically, when organizations say, you know what, we've tried a lot of the things and we have a feeling that there's something bigger that we should be asking for. And they don't necessarily have to know, and we don't have to know. But our role is to continually ask, to Adrian's point, what is that systems change that needs to happen? Who is actually deciding what gets how work gets categorized? Who at the DOL is actually doing that work? What are corporations allowed to do when they're merging and acquiring other companies? Do they actually have to take workers into account? Oh no, they actually don't at all. Like, we only say like, oh, well, does it impact consumers negatively? Maybe, then maybe we'll say something about it. But these are the kinds of questions that we are walking with folks. So we often hold like vision and values sessions first, just to say, where are you all at? Where are you trying to go? What are your values? And then we start listening to what are the real root issues. And then walking a path of asking the questions of who's making those decisions, who's actually benefiting. Can you tell the truth to your constituents and to your base and your communities about who's actually making these decisions? And then what should we be asking for, not only today and tomorrow in the halls and in our regulations, not only in legislation and regulations today and tomorrow, and not only programmatic work, but how do we actually stop having this fight around navigating terrible systems? Like, we really don't want to have this fight over and over again, right? And so I think that's where, I mean, I'm hopeful that what folks are hearing is that artists have the ability to come together and have a louder voice than just as individuals, right? Both through the culture change piece, but also actually as agents of change on the economy.
Here. I'll let that, and if anybody wants to respond to Solana, I'll leave a little space for that. There's one question in the chat that I can go to. All right, I'll go to the question. The question is, Adrian. Wait, I gotta find it. Adrian,
Yes.
was your presentation to Congress recorded?
Yes, it was. Unfortunately, now I have to. I can go, now everybody can see me, and I have to go back and look at myself. But yes, it was. Yes, it was. And I can. How do I share that? Is the follow-up question to share it?
I would assume so, but we could try to
Okay.
figure out how to get it into the chat for you.
Okay.
And by we,
If
I
you know the
mean,
committee name, you could just say the committee and the D, and people can just go to the committee website and pull it too.
House Committee on Oversight and Reform.
Do you remember the title of the hearing or the date?
Yes, following the money, tackling improper payments in government, something like that.
we'll find
I
it.
mean, that's a long title, remember?
We'll drop it in the chat. I promise we'll drop it in the chat.
Great, yeah.
Okay, so I guess I'm, yeah, okay. So there's nothing else in the Q&A. So I'm going to close us out with one last round robin for the panel, which is, I know I keep it keeps going towards cynicism and the system, it's true and it's hard and we all have a lot of work in front of us. So it's a two-part question, which is first, what, thinking about your goals for the future and your work, what keeps you up at night and what gives you hope? And if you could end on the hope, I would appreciate it because we want to end in an uplifting fashion at the end of the day. And maybe I can call on you guys, or if anybody's feeling inspired, you can just jump on in.
I have an 18-month-old. That's what keeps me up at night. And what gives me hope is exactly what Adrian said, which is young people, because they know how to have fun and they know how to keep it real and 100. And I just look forward to being able to support young people and especially young artists in telling those stories.
I can go next. My goals and what keeps me up at night are so many small business owners are making the conversion to going back to work. And I get it. Like, people have to do what they have to do, and I understand that. But what gives me hope is this resignation life that people are stepping into and living their true passion and thriving in it. Now, I understand everybody can't do it, but I do believe that a lot of people are trying to make a work-life balance that's better for them, and that people are really stepping into the space of their own true happiness and really just trying to figure out what that is. So whatever that is, whether it's going back to work, starting their own business, people are just trying to thrive, and we're here to advocate and support for them either way.
Sorry about my dogs. They're very loud. I have lots of them. I'm going to go next because what keeps me up at night and what gives me hope is the same thing, and it's social media. I doom scroll on Twitter, unfortunately. But at the same time, I think that there's power in information sharing. And I think that more people have more access to more ways to learn more information. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. And I do think that making people more aware and removing some of the myths and, pulling back the curtain is happening across, at least in my space, all areas of academia and government and corporate governance. And that's happening slowly but surely. And part of it's being facilitated by social media. And so it does keep me up at night, and it, is, terrifying, but at the same time, it does give me hope. And so I do think that is, I think social media is one way that, we can have more people have more information and more understanding about how to get engaged and why it matters to them. I think that's important.
Althea, am I closing this out? I think it's me, right? I think what keeps me up at night is doing this work on gig stuff, honestly. And it's what I think about in the shower, and mostly because I'm scared. I'm really thinking about the fear that comes along with this, investigating this work, asking questions about this kind of work, finding sort of proof points and stuff that works in this space, particularly inside the labor movement and inside philanthropy, can be a bit of a curse. The pitchforks start to come out when you start to question the current regime for employment in this country. And so, doing the work and speaking on panels like these and others, I'm scared because you never know, right? Tradition is a powerful thing, and it does tend to show up in very ugly ways sometimes when you're talking about taking care of workers in new and different ways that have never been really taken care of before in this country. I'll go with the youth thing on hope, and I'll just point out two people who probably everybody knows who Chris Smalls is, the leader of the Amazon Fight Back Union in New York, who I think just the visual of that guy, is a young Black rapper who had nothing to lose, and that is like the face of a labor movement. I won't say the labor movement, but a labor movement I think is really hopeful, a really hopeful signal. There's also this young woman, if you haven't looked up their organization, her name is Ligia Gualpa, and she's the leader of an organization called Los Deliveristas in New York. And they are doing probably the most they are like non-English speaking immigrant delivery workers in New York who are using the sort of Uber algorithms against themselves and manipulating that technology to organize. And that is the kind of organizing that I don't think we've ever seen before. And so it gives me a lot of hope. And I'm proud to fund them. They're awesome.
Amazing. Well, I will just close it out by saying, what keeps me up at night? I don't know, that the problems just like they stay the same and they stay the same, and you talk about them for years and years and they still feel like they stay the same, even as I think we are making some incremental progress. And I think the thing that gives me hope is honestly like Adrian, you saying, the pitchforks come out, and watching everybody in this room like nod and say, oh yeah, that makes me feel like there is opportunity for cross-sectoral like coalitions engagement, and that like the community of folks, there is potential, like huge potential for folks from many different communities to come together around a shared agenda and shared goals and a shared vision. And that gives me a lot of hope. And you people give me a lot of hope, period. So thank you, all of you, for taking the time. And thank you for everybody who is watching. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.